Thank you, Mr Speaker. Following on from the last National Party Speaker, I just want to refer back to what Jonathan Naylor said. He referred to the fact that the national government haven't reached a surplus for the last 7 years, and then said that Labor is fixated on money. As a default position, because they have failed 7 years in a row to reach a surplus, he said that's because National care about people. Now, Mr Speaker, there is something wrong with that whole picture. Mr Speaker, it is not that difficult to reach a surplus. This side of the House did it for 9 years straight. 9-0, Mr Speaker, 9-0. I think they need to be reminded of that because, Mr Speaker, they have proven for the last 7 years that they cannot responsibly manage this country's economy. Mr Speaker, that is not what I wanted to focus the speech on, but I couldn't help but refer to that after Jonathan Naylor's speech. What I wanted to concentrate on, Mr Speaker, is that the government's budget really is a continuation of its plan to experiment with some of the most vulnerable members of our society, namely sole parents and mental health beneficiaries. And, Mr Speaker, what really, just from the beginning, upsets me is the way they refer to sole parents and mental health beneficiaries. Under their investment approach, they refer to them as high liability. Not people who are vulnerable and need of help, but high liability. That's how they refer to people, Mr Speaker. Under this most recent budget, the government is trying to introduce an experimental and untested system of social improvement bonds for mental health beneficiaries, and we have very real concerns. We don't even know, Mr Speaker, what the outcomes or results are from the mental health employment and sole parent employment trials are, which cost taxpayers a total cost of $5.9 million over the last 2 years. These trials involved the contracting out of case management that would otherwise be undertaken by WINS. It involved support for employment placements to 25 private sector providers, 2 of which, APM and WorkCare Limited and Mental Health Solutions Limited, received almost $1 million each. But where are the results, Mr Speaker? Where's the so-called return on investment from these trials? According to the Social Development Minister, 3,377 individuals were referred to the mental health employment services trials, of which only 998 individuals were enrolled as at the end of February 2015. 414 of those individuals had been placed into employment at the end of February 2015, of which 63 individuals exited the service after achieving 12 months continuous employment. 171 of those individuals were still in the service, having achieved 6-month continuous employment, and 180 individuals were still in the service and yet to achieve 6 months continuous employment. So what happened to the other 2,379 individuals who were referred as part of the trial? And that's our concern, that that same model will be carried over to the social impact bonds. Who will these providers or organisations choose to take on? And what does it mean for those that aren't taken on? What does it mean for the 2,379 out of 3,377 that weren't picked up by these providers to place them into employment? And what was the criteria for trying to place them into employment? Who do we think they would have chosen? They would have chosen the people who were experiencing mental health difficulties or mental illness, but that were the most employable. Why? Because they wanted to see their outcomes attained. And so that government is going to use that kind of measure to say that the private sector is better at doing it than the state, but it's jigged. It's a complete jig-up, Mr Speaker, and we can see that just by these employment trials that have been undertaken for those who are experiencing mental illness. Further, Mr Speaker, the Minister of Social Development has said it does not hold information in relation to the roles and qualifications of staff from contracted providers delivering either trial. So here you are, or here they are, contracting providers to work with some of the most vulnerable. We're talking about people with mental illness, but these providers have no qualifications or they have no experience that the government knows of as to be able to work with people who have mental illness, Mr Speaker. It is irresponsible. And going back to the government's own language, that these clients are high liability, well, I just want to say I think the only liability here is the national government for this country. Mr Speaker, when we look at Sole parents, we see that the sole parents and their children will bear the brunt of this budget. Now, we hear from that side of the House that they're giving $25 to sole parents or to beneficiaries, not per child, but per family. And Mr. Speaker, it's something, but it is not enough. As the Children's Commissioner has said, it's a surprise, but it's not a plan. It's not a plan to address the issue of poverty that we are facing as a country. Under this budget, Mr. Speaker, yes, they've said that they will give an additional $25 per family on benefits, $25 per family, not per child, but we've also seen their work obligations extended for sole parents from 20 hours a week, 15 hours a week to 20 hours a week. And I've had lots of constituents contacting me, Mr. Speaker, about their concerns about this. The major concern being that what the government's not taking into consideration is that what is subsidised is 20 hours, and even then that 20 hours can't always be accessed, and yet the government hasn't taken into consideration that not only do the parents need to put their children in ECE, but they need travel time to be able to get there to drop them off and then pick them up, Mr. Speaker. Many of these parents are saying 15 hours a week, if they can access the 20-hour subsidy, is just enough because it includes the time that they need to work as well as the travel time to getting to the early childhood centre and then picking them up afterwards. That wasn't taken into consideration. On top of this, sole parent support beneficiaries have to reapply for their benefit every year at that anniversary. They also have to go back to work, Mr. Speaker, when their child turns 3 as opposed to 5. And we talked about this amongst ourselves, some of the women in caucus. Some of us did that, Mr. Speaker, but circumstances are very different for different people in terms of the work that they go into. Some of us have flexible working arrangements. Some of us are able to in terms of the amount of money that we earn, and that's not going to be the case for every parent. What also doesn't seem to be taken into consideration by what the government announced in their budget is what about the number of children that their sole parents have? If you're looking at a sole parent with one child, maybe, just maybe, that's more possible than the sole parent who has 2, 3, 4, 5 children. It becomes more and more difficult when you look at the number of children. So just to have this kind of blanket approach to things is actually really irresponsible and not fair to the parents that we're talking about. The change that the government is looking to introduce is going to affect 70,373 sole parents, and I just want to point out actually that approximately 90% of those parents are women. They are women raising children by themselves. Now, what does that say about the way that government thinks about those women or addresses the needs of those families? What does it say about them, actually? It says they don't really care, they're punitive, they're judgmental, and they're just saying, we don't care about your circumstances, get out and work regardless of how things are for you. Mr. Speaker, there was a lot in this budget from a social development perspective to be concerned about. Looking at the reprioritisation of funding to the social sector and the impact that will have on NGOs is another big issue. Mr. Speaker, we already see with Relationships Aotearoa, the demise of Relationships Aotearoa, and we know already that there are NGOs out there who have very, very good reputations in their local communities, who have served their local communities and vulnerable people for decades, many of them, and yet they are feeling the brunt of this budget as well. They are concerned about what this budget will mean for them and their ability to continue doing the important work that they've been doing for many, many years. Mr. Speaker, this budget is not about people, like Jonathan Naylor has said. It's not even about money. Mr. Speaker, the national government have failed on both fronts in this budget, and Mr. Speaker, it won't take long for the rest of New Zealand to see through that.